I don't care who you are. Get out of that cabin before I call the police. Karen shrieked the moment she saw me strike a match and light a fire on the land I've legally owned since 1987. To her, I was nothing more than a squatter, some drifter who had no business setting foot in the Ho's precious retreat. Minutes later, 3 patrol cars roared to a stop at the forest entrance, sirens echoing through the trees. Karen dashed forward, flailing her arms like she was reporting an armed robbery, pointing at me and shouting, "That's him!" But then one officer stepped out. His gaze lingered on me for just a moment before he straightened, pulled his belt tight, and gave me a crisp military salute. Silence fell over the clearing as though even the forest had realized Karen had just made a colossal mistake. Sometimes the person you think is a nobody turns out to be the one who wrote the very rules you're trying to twist. That October morning mist was still lifting when I turned my old Chevy down the dirt road leading to my grandfather's cabin. After 35 years in the Army, this 40-acre patch of wilderness had become my sanctuary. Sarah loved this place before cancer claimed her 2 years ago. She'd sketch leaves by the fire pit while I pretended to read. Now it was just me, chasing the kind of peace only these woods could give. The cedar cabin with its stone chimney wasn't worth much on paper, but it carried decades of meaning. I was splitting kindling when a spotless BMW X7 rolled down the access road. Inside sat a blonde woman in oversized sunglasses, phone already raised and recording. "Excuse me," she called without lowering her window. "This is private property. You can't just camp here." Her voice dripped with entitlement. The red recording light confirmed she was live streaming the encounter. "I'm going live to document this trespasser," she narrated. "We've had issues with homeless people trying to invade our community." I set the axe down and kept my hands visible. Military training had taught me how to de-escalate situations, but her performance told me she wasn't interested in reason. "Ma'am, I think there's been a misunderstanding," I said calmly. "I'm James Morrison, and this is my land. I can show you the deed if you'd like." I reached for my wallet deliberately, knowing every move would end up on her video feed, but she didn't even glance at the paperwork. "Nice try," she scoffed. "I'm Margaret Wellington, president of Pine Ridge Estates Ho. I know every homeowner here, and you're not one of them." She lifted her phone higher, making sure my face filled her stream. "I'm also known as Iron Karen, and today I'm exposing another squatter trying to set up camp in our pristine community." The irony wasn't lost on me calling herself Iron Karen while accusing me of being the problem. "Mrs. Wellington." I tried again. "My grandfather, Joseph Morrison, left me this property in 1987. Please, look at the deed." But she was too busy playing to her audience. "Fake papers," she sneered. "This land has been under Ho jurisdiction for 20 years. Your scam ends now." She punched in 911. "Yes, police. I'm being threatened by a vagrant. He has a weapon and he's acting aggressive." I stood there, listening to her fabricate a crime out of thin air. "Ma'am, I haven't threatened you," I stated clearly for the camera. "I've only shown you legal documents proving ownership." If this turned into my word against hers, I wanted evidence. "Don't gaslight me," she shrieked, parroting the buzzwords she probably picked up online. "You people think you can just move into decent neighborhoods and take over. Not here. Not on my watch." The phrase "you people" carried weight I didn't appreciate. Judging by her tone, my old work clothes and beat-up truck were all she needed to cast me as an outsider. Her live chat was exploding as some cheering her bravery, others questioning her story. "The police are coming," she announced triumphantly. "We'll see who really belongs here." I turned away, walked back to the cabin steps, and placed Sarah's photo gently on the railing. "Am I?" I whispered in Vietnamese, the language I'd learned on my first deployment. Sarah would have diffused this whole thing in minutes. But Sarah wasn't here. The flashing lights appeared through the trees, sirens wailing as 3 cruisers pulled up exactly the dramatic entrance Iron Karen wanted for her stream. I set Sarah's picture down and stood ready to face whatever storm she had unleashed. What she didn't realize was that the old jacket I wore bore one detail she'd never recognize but every soldier would. On the collar rested a faded silver star insignia, real, not some surplus store trinket. It had been earned through decades of blood, sweat, and sacrifice in places most Americans couldn't even pronounce. And once the right pair of eyes caught sight of it, Everything about this little host aunt was about to change. Karen nearly sprinted from her luxury SUV as if she were starring in her own reality show. Phone held high, she waved frantically at the first patrol car like she was orchestrating a film scene. "Officers, thank heavens you came. This vagrant has been threatening me and refuses to leave private property. He claims he owns this land, but that's simply impossible," she declared dramatically, pointing in my direction. Her voice carried the perfect mix of fear and authority for her livestream audience. The comments were flashing across her screen faster than she could even glance at them, half cheering her on, half questioning her story, but she was too busy with her performance to notice. The lead officer stepped out, a man in his early 40s with a faint stiffness in his left leg. It was a telltale gait I'd seen before, an old injury, the kind that soldiers carried home long after the battlefield. His nameplate read Rodriguez, and the way his eyes paused on my collar told me everything I needed to know. "Ma'am, I'll need you to step back," Rodriguez said firmly, his tone professional but edged with authority. He moved towards me, eyes locked on the insignia sewn into my faded jacket. When he got close enough to confirm it, his posture changed instantly. The man who had just approached me with cautious authority suddenly snapped to rigid attention. His hand rose in a perfect salute, sharp, crisp, the kind drilled into soldiers long ago. The forest went still. Even Karen's live stream, still rolling, seemed to catch the gravity of that moment. "Major General Morrison," Rodriguez said, his voice cracking slightly with emotion. "Sir, it's an honor." Sergeant Rodriguez, a 3rd Infantry Division, formerly. The confident smirk on Karen's face evaporated. Confusion flickered into shock, then panic. Her viewers exploded with reactions. "Wait, what? A broken bar? Karen's done for. A broken bar? Respect the general." Her comment feed was now a flood she could no longer control. I returned Rodriguez's salute and extended my hand. "At ease, Sergeant. Good to see you again." Recognition hit as soon as he mentioned his unit. "Afghanistan. 2018. You were the one caught in that Eid blast outside Kandahar." His eyes softened. "Yes, sir. And you carried me 3 clicks back to the FOB when the medevac couldn't land. Doc said I wouldn't have made it another hour without you." His voice grew thick, the gratitude unmistakable. Then he turned toward Karen, his tone dropping to an icy chill. "Ma'am, do you have any documentation proving your authority over this property?" Karen faltered. "Yeah, I'm the president. This whole area falls under our jurisdiction. He's just squatting here illegally." Rodriguez crossed his arms, unimpressed. "Then show me paperwork to back that up, because from where I'm standing, it looks like a lawful property owner is being harassed on his own land." He looked at me respectfully. "General Morrison, do you have your deed?" I handed over the documents, the same ones Karen had brushed aside earlier. Rodriguez examined them with care, scanning survey maps, signatures, and dates. Finally, he nodded. "Deed issued 1987, taxes up to date, boundaries clearly marked. This is legitimate." Karen's face burned crimson as the realization sank in. Her live broadcast was no longer a triumphant crusade, it was a train wreck, unfolding in front of thousands of viewers. The #IronKaren vs. General was already spreading across her feed, and public opinion was tearing her apart. "This can't be right," she sputtered, clinging to the last of her bravado. "I know every property owner in Pine Ridge. He's hiding something." Rodriguez's patience thinned. His voice went flat. "Ma'am, I'll give you one more chance. Either provide legal documentation for your claims to broken bar or stop this charade. If you can't show any legal basis for your authority over this property," Rodriguez said firmly, "then you're the one trespassing." The other officers nodded in agreement, their silence carrying more weight than any argument Karen could make. I could see her carefully constructed confidence starting to collapse under real scrutiny. Rodriguez turned back to me, his expression shifting to one of respect and maybe even relief. "Sir, I apologize for the trouble this has caused. Is there anything else we can do for you today?" But I knew this wasn't the end. Karen wasn't the type to back down quietly. She believed hiring an $800 an hour attorney would settle everything in her favor. What she didn't realize was that I'd co-authored military manuals on land disputes and had spent more time in legal briefings than she'd spent binge-watching reality TV. Margaret Wellington was about to discover that when you go toe-to-toe with someone who understands both the law and human nature, you'd better bring more than theatrics. Within a day of her livestream disaster, Karen had assembled what she thought was an impressive legal weapon. Her attorney, Harrison Blake of Blake, Sterling Associates, arrived at my cabin in a Mercedes that cost more than most people's homes. He looked exactly like you'd imagine, a flawless suit, an over-polished briefcase, and the smug aura of a man who'd rarely been challenged in his career. "Mr. Morrison," Blake announced without pleasantries, "my client, Mrs. Wellington, has retained me to resolve this property dispute. We believe you are unlawfully occupying this land, and we are prepared to pursue all available remedies." With a practiced flourish, he handed me a thick envelope. "That is a cease and desist order requiring you to vacate within 72 hours. I opened the packet and skimmed through it. There were broken bar flaws obvious as if that he had either overlooked or ignored in his rush to intimidate me. "This is fascinating," I said, glancing up at him with faint admiration. "Tell me, did you actually research the property boundaries before filing this, or were you just relying entirely on your client's word?" The document claimed I was encroaching on common grounds, a bold accusation, if it hadn't been complete nonsense. "Mrs. Wellington has served as Hope president for over a decade," Blake replied stiffly. "She knows this community better than anyone." Behind him, I spotted Karen sitting in her BMW, phone propped up, no doubt broadcasting this as part 2 of her personal reality show. "Your supposed ownership papers are outdated," Blake continued. "They've been superseded by community development agreements established in 2003. I smiled faintly. "Interesting theory, but my deed predates your hoe by 15 years. You might recall something called grandfathered rights, a property law 101. I believe." I handed him my deed and survey maps. "You'll also notice my property taxes have been paid in full every year since 1987. That usually creates a very solid chain of ownership." Blake's confidence faltered as he skimmed the papers. I could almost see him calculating how little homework his firm had done before cashing Karen's check. "We'll need to verify these," he muttered, his voice suddenly less commanding. "There may still be zoning concerns or environmental restrictions to consider." "Of course," I said evenly. "While you're checking, you might also want to research whether Mrs. Wellington has any authority to make legal claims about land she doesn't own. Filing false documents is a serious matter. Fraudulent representation, too." I'd seen plenty of intimidation tactics over the years. This was amateur hour. Karen, apparently restless in her car, came striding over with her phone already recording. "He's just stalling and twisting the facts," she declared to her viewers. "Mr. Blake has already explained the community rules, so he can't just ignore them." Her voice carried the desperate edge of someone still smarting from yesterday's public humiliation. "Mrs. Wellington," Blake said quietly, clearly uncomfortable, "perhaps we should continue this discussion privately." He knew her livestream antics were undermining whatever shaky legal case they had. Nothing cripples a lawyer's position faster than a client loudly making unsupported claims for the internet to see. But Karen wasn't about to step away from her stage. "I've been protecting this neighborhood from undesirable elements for years," she announced proudly, as if her audience hadn't just watched her argument fall apart. "We have standards here, and we can't just let anyone move in." Karen's words dripped with condescensionate talk of protecting property values that barely hid the classist undertones she'd been nursing since the start. That evening, another attack arrived, this time by email. It claimed to be from the law offices of Harrison Blake, accusing me of trespassing, vandalism, and even threatening behavior toward neighbors. The scare tactic might have worked on someone less experienced, but there were 2 problems. First, real attorneys don't send threatening emails from Gmail accounts. Second, whoever wrote it clearly didn't understand half the legal terms they were trying to use. It read less like a lawyer's letter and more like someone had copy-pasted jargon from a legal advice blog. I forwarded the message to my son, Michaela, a partner at a real firm in Washington, D.C. His reply arrived within the hour. "Dad, this is either a fake lawyer or the worst one in Virginia. Also, why didn't you tell me you were in the middle of this? I've been looking for an excuse to come visit." Karen had just made a crucial mistake. She thought she was dealing with a solitary old man, What she didn't realize was that my family tree included actual lawyers and I wasn't facing this fight alone. The next morning, reinforcements of a different kind appeared. A county inspector showed up, clipboard in hand, claiming there were permit irregularities with my cabin. When I asked who had filed the complaint, he vaguely said it came from concerned community members. It was obvious what was happening. Karen had shifted tactics from weak legal threats to bureaucratic harassment, using her Hill connections to apply pressure where lawyers had failed. But she had no idea who she was really up against. Declaring war on a retired major general meant stepping into a battlefield defined by strategy, logistics, and intelligence. And word was spreading fast. When the phrase Major General Morrison being harassed hit the Veterans Brotherhood Facebook group, it was like sending up a flare. Karen hadn't picked a fight with one man in the woods, so she'd picked a fight with a brotherhood forged in combat. At dawn on Thursday, I realized the tide had shifted. I was pouring coffee when I heard the low rumble of engines echoing down the forest road. Not one or two motorcycles, a convoy. By the time I stepped outside, a dozen Harley-Davidsons rolled into my clearing. Their riders wore leather vests heavy with military patches. At the front was Tommy Tank Martinez, a master sergeant I'd served with in Iraq. He grinned like we'd just completed a successful mission. "Morning, General," Tank called out, swinging off his bike in one smooth motion. "Heard you were having some trouble with the local homeowners association. Figured you could use a little broken bar community support." Behind him, the rest of the crew got to work with practiced efficiency, setting up folding chairs and a table as though they'd done this 1,000 times. "Hope you don't mind," Tank added, "but word gets around in the veteran community. When one of our own is hassled, we don't sit it out." Within the hour, my quiet retreat looked less like a cabin in the woods and more like a reunion crossed with a field operation. Pickup trucks, RVs, and cars with veteran license plates from 3 states rolled in. Each arrival brought a story of how they'd heard about my situation, a proof that the veteran network runs faster and stronger than any social media algorithm. The irony wasn't lost on me. Karen had tried to weaponize the internet against me, but her live streams had only amplified her own arrogance. In veteran circles, her footage was spreading like wildfire. Screenshots of her calling me a vagrant and demanding ID had sparked outrage. To them, she hadn't insulted just me, she disrespected the uniform, and that made it personal. "Sir, you'll want to see this," said Maria Santos, a former Army communications specialist, who had already set up what looked like a mobile command post complete with laptops and satellite internet. She spun her screen toward me. "Your president is having one hell of a week online." Karen's follower count was plummeting by the hundreds. Every post she made was buried under waves of angry comments. The hashtag #IronKaren vs General was trending, but not at all the way she'd hoped. The real turning point came at noon when Michael finally arrived. I hadn't seen him in over a year. Too many deployments had left scars between USA missed birthdays, missed dinners, but now, there he was. He stepped out of his BMW in a tailored DC suit, looking around at the chaos of veterans setting up camp like it was a tactical operation. "Dad," he said quietly. For a moment, neither of us knew what to do. Then Tank let out a sharp whistle. "Attention!" he barked. Instantly, every veteran in the clearing dropped what they were doing and snapped to attention, eyes fixed on me and my son. The silence that followed was profound, heavier than any courtroom, sharper than any argument. The clearing was quiet except for the wind moving through the trees. Tank stepped forward, his voice formal and steady. "Sir, your son has arrived." It was more than an introduction, it was a gesture of respect, the kind only military families truly understand. It acknowledged both the weight of service and the toll it takes on those who love someone in uniform. Michael's composure faltered. His eyes swept over the assembled veterans standing at attention. "Jesus. Broken bar, you never told me about this." He motioned toward the men and women who had dropped everything to rally around me. "I knew you were respected." His voice trailed off as the reality hit him. My service had built a network of loyalty far deeper than anything his law firm could grasp. "Son," I said quietly, "there are things you can't explain, you have to live them. These people understand loyalty in ways most civilians never will." I put a hand on his shoulder. The distance that years of deployments had carved between us seemed to shrink. Your mother always said military families serve too even if they never put on the uniform. By afternoon, the news was spreading. Karen's grip on the hoe was cracking. Mrs. Chen, one of the older board members who had always bowed under Karen's bullying, called me personally. She apologized for the harassment and admitted several board members were pushing for an emergency meeting to address Karen's behavior. Even in Ho politics, openly attacking a decorated veteran was a bad look. But the real turning point came when Tank approached, his usual grin gone. "General, you should see this." He handed me a folder. "Couple of the guys did some digging on your Ho president." Inside were financial records of community funds funneled into companies Karen had personal stakes in, maintenance fees inflated far beyond the work performed. It wasn't headline-grabbing fraud, but it was evidence of self-dealing that wouldn't stand up to scrutiny. "Where did you get these?" I asked. Tank gave a shrug and the kind of innocent smile that wasn't fooling anyone. "Let's just say one of our people works in county administration. Public records are interesting things, a broken bar if you know which doors to knock on." Karen Wellington had assumed she could push around one old man until he left in silence. What she didn't anticipate was a community that knew how to gather intelligence, leverage connections, and stand shoulder to shoulder in defense of one of their own. When legal threats and Ho pressure failed, she decided to go for the kill. Showed my military record, the very foundation of the respect I carried. The one thing she believed she could twist into a weapon against me. She was about to learn a lesson. If you try to destroy a soldier's honor, you'd better understand exactly who you are dealing with and the allies that soldier has made over decades of service. The attacks came all at once, coordinated with the kind of precision Karen probably thought made her clever. First, an article appeared in the community newsletter hinting that a local resident, clearly me, might be struggling with combat-related psychological issues that posed potential risks to neighbors. It didn't name me, but the insinuation was obvious. Unstable veteran, dangerous presence. That same day, Karen hired Thompson Investigative Services, a private firm that advertised background verification for community safety. Their assignment: tear apart my military history and find something, anything that could be twisted to paint me as a threat. What she didn't know was that the investigator she'd hired, Marcus Webb, was no ordinary spy. He was a former military intelligence officer. He had served alongside my unit on multiple deployments, and his work identifying IED networks in Afghanistan had saved more American lives than Karen could imagine. When Marcus opened the file and saw who his target was supposed to be, his decision was immediate. This wasn't about a paycheck, this was about loyalty. That evening, my phone rang. "General Morrison," Marcus said, his tone clipped with restrained anger. "I thought you should know Mrs. Wellington hired me to dig through your service record. She wants anything that might suggest you're unstable or dangerous." He paused before adding, "She specifically asked me to look for civilian casualties or disciplinary actions." I wasn't shocked by Karen's strategy. What impressed me was her complete ignorance of how military intelligence networks really work. "Marcus, I appreciate the warning," I said. "What did you tell her?" The irony was thick. Karen had paid a former intelligence officer to investigate someone he'd once stood beside in combat. "I told her investigations like this take time," Marcus said. "She's expecting a preliminary report in 2 weeks. What I didn't mention is that my report will be very thorough, complete with documentation of her request that I fabricate evidence if I couldn't find anything real." The satisfaction in his voice was unmistakable. Karen had just handed him the ammunition that could permanently destroy her credibility. But she wasn't finished. Karen's so-called nuclear option was already in motion. She had convinced a local TV reporter to take interest in a story about veterans, mental health, and community safety. It was designed to spark fear and put pressure on me to leave Pine Ridge quietly. The reporter, Jennifer Walsh from Channel 7, had been fed a narrative about how hoes should be careful about who they let into their neighborhoods, a thinly veiled code for veterans like me. Karen's plan was clear. She'd appear on camera as a concerned leader, claiming she wanted to balance compassion with safety, while planting the idea that my presence posed a risk to families. It was a smear campaign disguised as civic duty. But then, life took a turn that Karen never could have planned. I woke to the smell of smoke and tang surgeon shouts outside. The old wiring in my cabin, which I'd been meaning to replace, had finally failed. Flames tore through the kitchen and raced toward the living room where Sarah's photographs, sketches, and 3 decades of our life together were stored. The volunteer fire crew arrived quickly, but by then the cabin was gone. Tank and the others had pulled me out, but everything inside was reduced to ash. Standing in borrowed clothes, watching 30 years of memories vanish in the fire, something inside me cracked. Sarah's wedding dress sketches, the letters she wrote during deployments, the photos of our happiest days, they were all gone. And yet, as the flames died and the rubble cooled, something unexpected came to light. Beneath the stone foundation, firefighters uncovered a hidden root cellar converted long ago into a fireproof chamber. Inside was a metal strongbox, untouched by fire or time. The next morning, when we pried it open, the contents changed everything. Inside was my grandfather's original will, and not the simplified version filed with the CalCA, along with survey maps and land purchase records dating back to 1925. Even more astonishing were the detailed documents showing every transaction tied to Pine Ridge, including proof that the Ho's property claims were built on forged records filed in the mid-1990s. Karen had hired an investigator to smear me, not realizing he was loyal to the same military brotherhood she sought to attack. She had tried to destroy my reputation with lies about instability, even as her own financial schemes were quietly being documented. And now, by sheer chance, a fire had uncovered the very evidence she had spent decades trying to keep buried. She was about to learn the hard way that some battles cannot be won once the truth steps into the light. I remembered the words of Karen's own mother, whispered to me earlier. Called David. Karen will need a lawyer. Now I understood why. The strongbox didn't just hold a will, it contained proof of a massive fraud. For nearly 30 years, Margaret Wellington had been forging documents, seizing land that didn't belong to her, and funneling money into her own accounts. The papers were explosive, not just for my case, but for every family she had wronged. Even more shocking was what the land records revealed. In 1925, my great-grandfather had purchased not only the 40 acres where my cabin stood, but also an additional 260 acres of land that now encompassed nearly all of Pine Ridge Estates. The Ho's very foundation rested on stolen ground. Michael spent the morning at the county recorder's office cross-referencing the strongbox documents with official archives. When he returned, his face was grim. "Dad, this isn't just about your property," he said, spreading copies across the makeshift table Tank had set up where the cabin once stood. "Karen has been filing false ownership claims for years, and she's been collecting Ho fees on land that legally belongs to our family." The land Michael uncovered wasn't even part of the development legally, and the financial trail was even more devastating. For over 2 decades, Karen had been collecting Ho dues from unsuspecting residents who believed their money funded maintenance and improvements. In truth, much of it had been siphoned off into shell companies that existed only on paper, entities tied directly to Margaret Wellington's business empire. The so-called contracts for landscaping, security, and property management were all inflated and funneled back to Karen's personal gain. But the most incriminating discovery came from a series of taped phone calls my grandfather had made when he first suspected something was wrong. Old school and suspicious of anyone tampering with land boundaries, he recorded every conversation with county officials, attorneys, and Karen herself. Those recordings revealed the truth. Karen knew from the very beginning she was stealing land. Her plan had been to bide her time until my grandfather passed away before pushing her scheme into action. Maria Santos, reviewing evidence on her laptop, could barely contain her outrage. "General, you need to see this," she said, turning her screen toward me. Mrs. Wellington's social media posts from a few years ago show her openly bragging about acquiring new community assets. She treated it like a business trophy, showing off how she expanded Ho authority and boosted property values through a decisive leadership. Screenshots displayed Karen boasting online about her accomplishments. By then, my decision was clear. Quietly battling this in courtrooms and back offices wasn't enough. My grandfather would never have accepted that. If Karen wanted attention with her live streams, I was going to give her more of it than she ever dreamed of on terms she couldn't control. I reached out to Jennifer Walsh at Channel 7 and told her I had a story that would blow her whole piece wide open. Within hours, a press conference was set in the clearing where my cabin once stood. Word spread quickly. Veterans, neighbors, and reporters gathered. By the time the cameras were set up, there were news crews from multiple stations, a regional paper, and nearly 200 people ready to witness what Tank had started calling the reckoning. Karen pulled up in her BMW, phone already in hand, live streaming her arrival. She strutted toward the crowd, brimming with false confidence. I'm here to provide context for whatever lies this unstable veteran is about to tell, she announced to her followers. The community deserves the truth. What followed was the kind of public unraveling that social media was built to immortalize. With every camera rolling, I laid out the evidence piece by piece, the forged property transfers, the diverted HO funds, the recordings of conversations with my grandfather, and the business records exposing years of theft. Then I turned to her directly. Mrs. Wellington, you called me a squatter and demanded proof that I belonged here. Well, here it is. I held up the original deed and survey maps. This land has belonged to my family since 1925. Every HO fee you collected, every intimidation tactic, every neighbor you bullied into selling it was all built on a lie. Her live stream caught the moment her polished mask shattered. The confident leader persona dissolved as she realized her 3-decade scam was being torn apart in front of both the press and her followers. You can't prove any of this, she stammered, though her voice trembled, betraying her fear. She could see the mountain of documents proving otherwise. We can prove all of it, Michael said firmly, stepping forward with a thick folder. Complaints have already been filed with the district attorney, the State Real Estate Commission, and the IRS. Your empire is finished, but the final blow came not from us, but from Mrs. China and elderly HO board member Karen had bullied for years. With surprising courage, she stepped before the cameras. She told my family we didn't belong here, Mrs. Chen said softly. She said people like us lowered property values and threatened to find legal ways to drive us out. I still have the recording. And just like that, the illusion Karen had built collapsed entirely, captured live for the world to see. Karen's final attempt to cling to control came in the form of a phone call. Shaking, she dialed in not her attorney, not her allies, but the one person she had invoked time and again when boasting about family loyalty. David, she whispered into the phone, her voice cracking, I need you to come home. I need my son. For someone who had spent the past week trying to destroy me, her desperation was hard to ignore. Margaret Wellington had spent 3 decades building an empire from lies, intimidation, and stolen money, and in the space of one press conference, that empire had unraveled into a stack of evidence that pointed toward prison. But that call revealed what really mattered to her, not power, not influence. Her son, Special Agent David Wellington of the FBI, the man she had spent her life trying to impress. What she didn't realize was that the son she'd raised to value integrity had become the kind of man who would not compromise those principles, not even for his mother. David arrived the next morning in a plain government sedan, a deliberate contrast to his mother's luxury car. He looked younger than I expected, mid-30s, sharp-eyed, carrying himself with the calm authority of someone long trained in federal law enforcement. When he stepped out and surveyed the scene, the reporters, the veterans, the rows of evidence Michael had carefully arranged at his face showed that he already understood how this story would end. Mom, he said softly, approaching her as she sat inside her car with the windows rolled up, clinging to the hope that the nightmare would simply disappear. We need to talk, and you need to turn that live stream off. The mix of relief and dread that washed over her face was unmistakable. She had counted on her son to use his federal badge to sweep her problems away, but the sternness in his expression told a different story. David, thank God you're here, she said, climbing out of her car with forced enthusiasm. These people are trying to ruin me. They've made up documents, fabricated everything. Mom, David cut her off firmly. Stop. His tone carried the authority of someone used to being obeyed. He pulled out his badge, turned to me, Michael, and Tank, and said, Special Agent Wellington, FBI Financial Crimes Division, I want to personally apologize for my mother's actions. What she's done here has nothing to do with federal law enforcement. The distance in his voice made it clear. He was here as an agent, not as her son. Then came the revelation that stunned everyone. David explained that Pine Ridge Estates' Ho had already been under federal investigation for months, part of a wider probe into corruption and property fraud across Virginia. We flagged this community after reports of unusual property transfers and suspicious financial activity, he told the crowd. What I didn't know until yesterday was that my own mother was the prime suspect. The weight of his words broke Karen in a way nothing else had. She staggered under the blow, the full Section 8 she had worn for decades collapsing. David, you don't understand, she pleaded through tears. I was building something meaningful for the community. I was creating value. Mom, David replied, his disappointment cutting deeper than any accusation. You stole nearly $400,000 from your neighbors. You forged deeds, filed false claims, pressured elderly families into selling their homes below value. That's not community service, that's organized crime. The precision with which he listed her crimes made it clear the FBI already had more than enough to prosecute. The charges alone could keep her behind bars for life. Wire fraud, mail fraud, real estate fraud, money laundering, even civil rights violations under the guise of whole authority. Watching it unfold was gut-wrenching, not just because her empire was crumbling, but because a son who had devoted his life to justice now had to put handcuffs on his own mother. Still, I knew the moment demanded more than humiliation and punishment. Stepping forward, I faced the cameras and the crowd. I want something understood, I said clearly. Yes, Mrs. Wellington committed crimes and must be held accountable, but this community needs more than just it needs healing. I stepped forward and shared something that had been weighing on me ever since the fire destroyed my cabana, but also revealed the truth about this land. I'm donating 200 acres of this property to the county, I announced, for a public park and campground. Veterans and their families will always be welcome here, free of charge. And we'll build spaces where the community can gather, celebrate, and reconnect, those spaces that bring people together instead of driving them apart. The idea wasn't mine originally. Years ago, Sarah had spoken about opening these woods to people who needed peace. It was her vision, and I finally understood how right she'd been. Then came the moment no one expected. Instead of insisting on prison, David suggested a different path for his mother, a sentence centered on service and restitution. Karen would work at a non-profit counseling center, helping others confront the very struggles that had fueled her own corruption, control, fear, and abandonment. My mother needs to see firsthand how her choices affected real people, David said firmly. Maybe, by helping others, she'll find a way to live with what she's done. To everyone's surprise, including her own, Karen broke down in genuine remorse. Through tears she whispered, I lost my husband because I couldn't stop controlling everything. I lost my son's respect because I believed power mattered more than integrity. I don't want to lose my chance to be better than the person I've been. It was the first true moment of honesty she'd shown throughout the ordeal. 6 months later, Pine Ridge Estates was thriving again. Financial management was open and transparent, with residents having a voice in every major decision. The Veterans Campground had just hosted its first family weekend. Karen, now serving her community service, helped organize activities with a humility no one thought possible. David came often, rebuilding a relationship with his mother, not on manipulation, but on truth. One evening, I sat near the fire pit beside my new cabin, watching Michael teach his daughter how to skip stones across the creek. Tank manned the grill, flipping burgers for a group of veterans and their families who had become weekend regulars. Mrs. Chen passed around Sarah's sketches, sharing stories of the woman who had loved this land long before any of us understood its true worth. And I realized something. The greatest victory isn't always defeating an enemy. Sometimes it's guiding them back to the person they were meant to be. Those who hurt us most are often carrying battles we cannot see. Karen's journey was proof that beneath anger and control lies fear and pain, and wounds that need healing as much as accountability. True strength isn't found in winning fights. It's found in creating space for people to grow, to change, and to become better than yesterday. Have you ever lived through a conflict that reshaped your view of forgiveness? Share your story in the comments below. If this touched your heart, please Please like and subscribe to Anna Drama Nest for more stories of resilience and redemption. And if you believe in second chances and the power of community healing, share this with someone who might need to hear it today. Your support helps us continue telling stories that matter, stories of struggle, strength, and hope.